Okay, so we're going to kick off with the third session this morning. So can I ask you to please take your seats, because we're just running a little bit behind time, and we can get going. So the third session, the title of it is Gauging the Potential Impacts of Pesticide Use Reduction on Crop Production. So we've three speakers, Meghan, Robert and Anne-Marie, but before we get into some of that, I'd just like to give some context to the overall, I suppose, theme of the session. Thanks. So what's the driver for pesticide use reduction? So we're all familiar with Farm to Fork, the ambitious target and strategy from the European Commission. And we're very familiar, obviously, the drive is to reduce pesticides by 50% and hazardous pesticides by 50% as well. Arising out of Farm to Fork, what we've seen is that it has led to an extra emphasis on the promotion of IPM. Now, IPM, Integrated Pest Management, obviously has been around for a lot longer than Farm to Fork, but because of the extra spotlight that's landed on IPM, we just want to focus a little bit on, I suppose, just the detail of it. We'd all be familiar with the IPM pyramid, but at the moment, a lot of farmers, obviously in the sector, are practicing aspects of IPM, whether it's rotation, crop choice, variety selection, etc., time of planting. Biological control, less so, probably due to uncertainty about some of the feasibility of some of the products that are new to the market as of yet, compared to the use of the standard pesticides that we'd be familiar with. Monitoring and evaluation, obviously, is something extremely important in terms of weed control, and will become even more important for other diseases that are out there. But in terms of IPM, what you can see, obviously, is that the bigger the step on the pyramid, the more emphasis that needs to be put on it. And what we see on the bottom, obviously, in terms of varieties, there's some really exciting varieties coming through in terms of virus resistance, but we need to see more of that coming through, because really that is the foundation of what's going to be a successful IPM strategy going forward. The key point to make, though, is that the use of pesticides is part of IPM. A narrative to suggest that they're not a core part of it isn't correct. They are needed. They're needed actually to support some of the varieties that will be coming through in terms of the resistance strategies. The key thing, though, is the judicious use of those chemicals, and that's what IPM is focused on. However, there are many knowledge gaps around IPM, and what you're going to hear from Meghan and Robert coming after me is the work that we're doing to address some of these knowledge gaps. Some of the things, obviously, the overall impact assessment from an Irish perspective. We've been very fortunate to capture the insight from experts around the sector in terms of that. As I said, the efficacy and feasibility of some of the non-chemical alternatives, the need for specific guidance in terms of some of our crops, and the monitoring systems. We have systems in place for BYDV that Louise and team have installed and got up and running in the last few years. And also, most importantly, what's out there in terms of the scientific literature. Can we learn from any of the lessons that other people have been building on? So we have initiatives in place to address some of these gaps. Two projects in particular. One that you're going to hear about, IPM 2030, funded by DAFM. We've looked at the global literature, as I said, on IPM efficacy. We're looking at assessing the impacts of the targets of sustainable use, of pesticide use, and a desk study on the non-chemical alternatives is currently underway, and we'll be reporting on that at the open day at the end of June. The other project is called AgroWise. It's an EU-funded initiative funded by DG Agri, Environment and Sante. And the goal of that, and we're leading one of the work packages, is to try and build a framework to support crop-specific IPM guidelines, which I can tell you is obviously not an easy task. Shay is going to touch on IPM Works, which is more focused on the KT side and extension out into the farmers. And you might be familiar with IPM Orama, which is a project we recently got funded and led by colleague Dan Milborn in Oak Park. And the focus is to not only deliver resistant varieties against biotic stressors, but also to match that with a complementary management regime. Because as I mentioned about the PPPs, having a resistant variety on its own is not enough. We need a robust management regime to support the resistance in the variety as well. So on Slido, there's a poll there, so I would ask you to please, during the session, to just take a second to put your input into it. And obviously, any questions after the speakers as well, please put them through Slido. So first up, we have Meghan Roberts, a postdoc.
Meghan England.
Meghan England, sorry, apologies. Meghan England, so a postdoc with us in Oak Park, going to tell us about the global literature on the impact of pesticide reduction. Thank you, Meghan.
Thank you, Ewan. Hello, everyone. So, amongst the global literature, there are some studies that have looked into the potential impacts of the farm-to-fork strategy. However, while they can give us some insight into the broader economic impacts, they often overlook the variation that can occur between specific crops and regions. Ireland, for example, has a unique climate and can experience its own distinct pest challenges. Therefore, it is crucial to evaluate how reducing pesticides will affect local cropping systems and make sure that they remain economically, environmentally, and socially sustainable. So, unfortunately, there is little data available into how to measure, being able to measure the potential impacts of pesticide reduction for Ireland. So, to address this gap, our study set out to review the existing research that looks at reducing pesticides and how that will affect crop sustainability at a global and European level. Specifically looking at yield, income, and socio-environmental outcomes, to identify trends and/or knowledge gaps, and the goal is to determine how this information can be used to estimate potential impacts of these reductions for Irish production systems. Conducting the literature review, we conducted an initial search which returned over 5,000 sources which matched our keywords. We were able to narrow this down by applying a specific selection criteria, and to be included, the sources had to examine how reducing pesticides could affect either crop yield or crop income or environmental or social sustainability. By applying this criteria to the titles and abstracts of those 5,000 sources, we were able to reduce the list down to 124. The reason for this big jump is because not only did the sources have to quantify the impact of pesticide reduction by comparing a reduced pesticide scenario with a baseline, such as a conventional cropping system, but pesticide reduction had to be the only variable looked at, or it had to be analysed separately compared to any other intervention, so that we'd have the confidence in the results we were taking, knowing that what we were seeing in the difference in yield or income was due to that pesticide reduction. So with that said, we read the full text of those 124 and were able to get a final list of 52 sources that directly measured the impact of pesticide reduction on one or more of these three categories. With the limited data that we got, we were unable to do a quantitative analysis on the crop income or the socio-environmental category, but yield-related results were more commonly reported, and we were able to do a further analysis of those. Before I move on, the limited amount of data wasn't the only challenge for this data set. There was also a lot of variability between the study designs of the sources that we did use. For example, there was large variation in the crop types that were reported. So 40% you can see were looking at grains and oilseeds, 19% were looking at vegetables, the remainder made up with tree fruits, pulses, fibre, pasture, and some were even looking at multiple crops and reported them just as a group. There was also large variation in location. As I mentioned, we were looking globally, and there for the rest of the world, the majority of them came from USA and Canada. And within the European countries, France was the biggest contributor. One note I want you to take from this graph is that there was no Irish studies involved. We weren't able to include any from Ireland. I'll move straight into the results, and to start with, we were able to assess the results by classifying them into different response categories. So we'll start with yield, and 85% of the results found yield to decrease with the pesticide reduction. Now, while this graph can show us the proportion of results that decreased, what it doesn't show us is how far did it decrease or what was the range in the data. That's what I'll get into later in detail with that further analysis for yield. But before I do that, we will look at income. And this was a much more even split. You can see 56% of results found income to decrease with the pesticide reduction, but 42% actually showed it to increase. And this can be due to reduced costs from using less pesticides, but also fluctuating commodity prices, for example. Socio-environmental outcomes, 73% of these were found to improve, as you'd expect. So that is like less toxicity in the environment, less risk to human health. But 22%, however, found it to decline or to worsen with the pesticide reduction. And these were more related to outcomes of increased fuel use or increased greenhouse gases. And these can be relevant to scenarios where herbicides are reduced and the alternative pest management strategies used require more machinery use, for example. So now I'll go back to the yield data that actually looks at the relationship between yield impacts and pesticide reduction. First, I'm just going to explain the graph so I don't confuse anyone. So along the bottom here, we've got a reduction in pesticide. So over at 0, that means no reduction in pesticide, and over to 100, that means no pesticides were used. It was a 100% reduction. Over at the side, we've got reduction in yield, and at the 0, at the red dotted line, that means there was no change in yield, and going up was 100% reduction in yield. So as we go up, the yield is going down. A simpler way to remember that, anything above the red dotted line is bad because yield is decreasing. Anything below is good because it's increasing. I'll start with just by putting in the relationship. So this is the trend line between reduction in yield and reduction in pesticide use. And you can see as pesticide reduces, reducing this way, yield reduction is also going up. So yield is also reducing. This trend was statistically significant, but it was weak. And when I add in the data points, you'll see that it's because of the variation amongst those data points. So each blue triangle is a result that's come out of one of the original sources. And if we look at the 50% pesticide reduction mark, you can see even though our average there is coming in at 15% yield loss with a 50% reduction, we have variability from no change all the way up to over 50% yield loss there. Same at the 100. Our average may be sitting at 30, but we've got cases from no loss, even gain, all the way up to 100% loss. So this variability is large, which makes that relationship weak. Another question you might be asking is why there's clusters at the 100 and the 50, and this is because of the variability in the study designs of the sources we use. So some sources were specifically looking at reducing pesticides by 50% or by 100%, whereas other studies, they're scattering in between. They were, say, looking at different farming systems or changes in systems that pesticide reduction just became a result of that. While I'm talking about that variability, I mentioned the different crop types and the different locations. And because this graph is showing all the data, what we wanted to do was refine that down to a more Irish relevant scenario. So we focused on the European data and the crop types that are a bit more relevant to Ireland, like the cereals, the pastures and the vegetables. And we ran it again. So the graph is laid out the same way, and it's the same data but reduced. And we got the same significant relationship, so the same trend of yield reducing as pesticide reduces, but with the same large variability. So what that means is that if we took this average figure of an 8% yield loss with a 50% pesticide reduction and used that for an economic income analysis, where what we're doing is completely missing this variability of what could happen. So we'd be overestimating what happens here and underestimating what happens here. So in conclusion, from this research, the variation between the studies makes using that average figure unreliable as an indicator for an impact estimate. And even though we have the trend, we know that yield may decline as pesticides reduce, that we have to investigate this on a case-by-case basis. And also that region and crop-specific research is essential to assess these impacts on Irish tillage systems. Thank you.
So next up we have Robert, and Robert's title is What do the experts think the impact of pesticide reduction in Ireland will be? And just before Robert starts, we just had a technical issue with Slido, so if you went to it, you couldn't put in your question, please have another go. It should be working now. Thank you. And the polls and question.
Thanks, folks. So pesticide use reduction, in this context, what we're talking about is the targets Ewen mentioned a moment ago from farm to fork. There's the 50% reduction in overall pesticide use, which the good news is Ireland has more or less reached. And then there's the 50% reduction in more hazardous substances by 2030 that Ireland still has some work to do on. And when we say more hazardous substances, what we mean in this context is substances that are classified as candidates for substitution by the European Commission. Basically, being a candidate for substitution means it's on a watch list of sorts. It's been identified as being hazardous, but it's also shown that it has quite a useful role. So the idea is it will be deregistered if a suitable replacement comes along or more data on the hazardous nature of it comes about. And what you see up on screen here is the active ingredients that are on that list that are registered for use in Irish arable cropping. And as I said, some of them may come off anyway. Flufenicet, in fact, the Commission just met in December and has announced a preliminary decision to no longer re-register that substance. So they're substances that may be going away in the future anyway, but in the interim, we're seeking to use less of them by 50% by 2030. So what might the impacts of this be? As Meghan just outlined, there's not really much in the way of published Irish data at all, and we can't really rely on the international literature to predict the Irish situation. Ideally, we carry out big, large-scale replicated field trials where we test different amounts of these chemicals and such, but of course that would be very time and resource intensive. So we wanted to see if there was another data source out there that we could use, and there certainly is. While there aren't many studies being published in peer-reviewed journals or anywhere else in Ireland about this subject, that doesn't mean people don't know about it. We're in a room here full of people who know a lot about the tillage sector, and so we wondered, can we take that untapped knowledge resource and get some reliable predictions out of it? So what we did with this, we did a repeated expert survey. It's sometimes referred to as a Delphi survey, named after the Greek oracle. And what we did, we sought out experts from throughout the tillage sector who might have an understanding of this. These people weren't just academics, weren't just Teagasc people, they were people from throughout the sector, people like specialist advisors, people who might have done trials for private companies, anyone who might have some first-hand experience with different pesticide management programs in the Irish tillage sector. And we ultimately got 17 agree to participate, which is a pretty typical number for a study like this. Now, I should point out, importantly, they were anonymous throughout. They had no idea who the other participants in the study were, and that's an important part of the Delphi process to ensure that social pressure doesn't bias the answers that come from panellists. So we asked these experts a whole lot of questions about the impacts that reducing use of those candidates for substitution would have on wheat and barley and oats. We asked them about the development of pesticide resistance that might occur, and we also asked them to compare scenarios where farmers stuck with current management practices versus a scenario where farmers increased the use of integrated pest management. After we'd asked those questions, here's where the repeated bit comes in, we compiled all that data into a big summary, sent that back to each of the experts so they could compare where their answers fell in relation to the group response, and gave them the opportunity to revise their answers if they thought that was necessary. And those revised second round answers were what we ultimately used as our results here. So what did we find? So I'm just going to give one example here first. This is winter wheat, and this is in the scenario where we stick with current management practices, so we're not assuming farmers adopt integrated pest management. The figures you see on those red bars are the median predicted loss of yield as a result of reduced use of the hazardous substances in each of the groups. And as you can see, they're reasonably high. It's predicted that there might be potentially a 15% loss in winter wheat yield as a result of reduction in the use of the fungicides, 10% for insecticides, 15% for herbicides in the short term. Now, these figures are all over a 5-year period, but for herbicides, given the potential for weed seed banks to build up over time and the quite significant concerns about resistance developing, we also asked about a longer period, a 10-year period, and the impacts there were even larger, potentially up to 30%. Of course, this is assuming farmers don't just stick with current management practices. It's obviously a somewhat artificial situation. We wanted to ask about it, though, as a counterpoint to the situation where use of IPM increases. So moving on to that then, we asked our panellists what IPM measures might be important in this future scenario with less access to these hazardous substances. What we did here, we gave them a whole long list of basically all the relevant integrated pest management techniques we could think of for each type of chemical. We told them they could add their own if there was anything we left off the list, and then we asked them to rank the importance of each one. And despite it being a big, long list, what you'll see is that these are the top 3 most important ranked for each category. They're pretty similar across the list. Resistant and tolerant cultivars were the most important measure for managing impacts of reduced use of both fungicides and insecticides, and changes in crop rotations were the most important, considered the most important technique for managing herbicide loss. And then you can see that changes in sowing date is shared across all of them, and decision support services is also important, so allowing farmers to make more strategic choices about where and when they apply their pesticides. So how effective did our panellists think these mitigation measures were? So these red bars is the same thing I showed you 2 slides ago for the winter wheat impacts. These blue bars show the projected impacts with an enhanced uptake of integrated pest management. They're lower, but they're obviously still not zero. Moving on from just winter wheat, that winter wheat is the same graph I just showed you. I just want to compare that with winter barley. As you can see, results are relatively similar, but a bit more of an impact from reduced insecticide use, of course, as a result of barley's greater susceptibility to barley yellow dwarf virus. And in winter oats, the impacts are a bit lower all around, mainly from the herbicide side of things due to oats' greater competitiveness against weeds. If we look at spring cropping, we only asked separately about seasons for the herbicide question, and as you see, it's predicted that impacts would be lesser in spring crops as a result of them spending less time in competition with weeds. So that's the data that our experts predicted. Where to from here? So important caveat, this is just expert opinion. In an ideal world, we'd carry out large-scale field trials to get an idea of what the impacts would be, and we'd also carry out a full economic evaluation, because as Meghan's data just showed, economic impacts don't necessarily flow on in an intuitive linear fashion from yield impacts. But with that, what else this data tells us is the way forward. In a future where there's less access to hazardous substances, this data tells us what we need to be focusing on, and it shows that we need to work on things like accelerating the development of resilient varieties of crops, providing better designing better cultural controls, such as optimised rotations for weed control, both designing them and then helping farmers implement them, and the better provision of decision support services. These could include written materials, these could include advisors with specialist training, anything that will help farmers apply pesticides strategically so that they get the most bang for their buck out of each litre of pesticide put on the field. And with that, I will hand over. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Robert. So next up we have AnneMarie Dillon from the Department of Ag, and AnneMarie is going to give us some insight into the regulatory perspective from the pesticide side. Thank you, AnneMarie.
Thank you, Ewan, and thank you to Meghan and Robert for their presentations. So as Ewan said, my name is AnneMarie Dillon. I'm the head of the Pesticide Control Division in the Department of Agriculture. So in my brief presentation this morning, I'd like to talk to you about the EU regulatory framework under which pesticides are regulated. I'll use the term plant protection product in between, but basically what I mean is everything fungicides, herbicides, insecticides, etc. So plant protection products are regulated under three broad legislations within the EU. Regulation 1107 of 2009 is the regulation of the placing on the market of plant protection products, covering the approval process at European level. We then have the Sustainable Use Directive, which we've heard a lot of discussion about in the last number of years, and I'll come back to that, and also Regulation 396 of 2005 regarding residues. So there has been, as I say, a lot of discussion on the Sustainable Use Directive, but just for now I'd like to focus in on the regulation relating to approvals, Regulation 1107 of 2009. So plant protection products have been regulated within the EU system since the early 90s. And active substances that are in plant protection products are evaluated and are part of a review program within the EU. And this involves a detailed scientific assessment and a rigorous peer review process, which is managed by the European Food Safety Authority. And this decision process is based on the conclusions of those scientific assessments. So I suppose when we talk about reduction in pesticide use, as Robert mentioned, I think it's important to remember that a lot of that reduction is related to this review program for active substances at European level, where they're non-approved, etc. So just to put that into a little bit of context from a figures point of view, as I mentioned, plant protection products have been regulated since the early 90s. And since 1991, 900 active substances have been removed from the EU. So roughly speaking, there are just over 400 active substances currently approved for use in the EU. And it's worth pointing out that approximately 100 of those are what we call low-risk active substances, so microorganisms, etc., and basic substance, so your milk and your vinegar and those types of things. So As I mentioned, there's a review programme ongoing for existing active substances, but also if there's new active substances coming into the European system, they also form part of the review process. And I think it's interesting to note that since 2020, there's been 13 new active substances or thereabouts brought into the EU or approved at the EU level. And all of these are what we call low-risk active substances. So I think that's an important point to note. And just again, thinking about it from an Irish context, so since in the last couple of years, of the substances that have been removed from the European system, 11 or thereabouts of those have been removed from the Irish market. So things like recently, I know we'll talk about it further, but things like ipoconazole or metribuzin, and obviously others as well. So just to go back a little bit on the Sustainable Use Directive that I mentioned, and there has been an awful lot of discussion, obviously, in the last couple of years about that. And back in 2022, the Commission put forward a proposal for a regulation, as we refer to as the SUR, to replace that directive. And this regulation was going to include additional requirements on the use and on training, etc., on application equipment, on use in specified areas. But it was also going to include a legal obligation or a legal requirement to implement the reduction targets that Robert and Ewen mentioned. So the discussions went on at Council and at Parliament level. And there was a lot of discussion in that area. And to be fair, there were some who felt it didn't go far enough, and there was obviously some who felt that it didn't go far, or went too far. So the Commission eventually withdrew that proposal in May 24. And we can talk about that maybe a little bit further. So we mentioned the farm to fork targets. So while the SUR is now being withdrawn, the targets or the ambitions within the European Union is still those reduction targets of a reduction of 50% in the overall use and risk of pesticides, and a reduction in the 50% of the more hazardous base. So those ambitions still are retained. I think, again, we mentioned the figures that Ireland, according to the up-to-date figures, have reached those targets from the point of view of the overall use of pesticides and risk. But as Robert alluded to, we're about halfway there on the more hazardous chemicals. But bear in mind what I mentioned about the regulation that I mentioned on the approvals. A lot of those active substances are going through that review programme. So regardless of what we do from the point of view of the sustainable use, that process is going to continue and likely remove more chemistry from the market. So we mentioned the Sustainable Use Directive, which the SUR was supposed to replace, but it's still here now. So there's been a renewed focus on that, and at European level there's a renewed focus on implementing this in a harmonised way across the EU, with a particular focus on integrated pest management. So under this directive, the rules that were there are maintained. So for example, you'll be aware of the registration of professional users and advisors, testing of application equipment, the requirement to implement IPM and to keep records of such, and to contain things like storage of plant protection products. So just to mention that is still there, is still an integral part of the European process. So I suppose what we talk about and what we can talk about as part of the panel discussion is, well, where are we now and what is the situation? So I suppose it's clear to see that the trend on the active substance approvals, and particularly on the chemical side of things, is showing a trend towards a less and less chemistry. There are increases in the more low risk, but again, we can talk about their proven how difficult they may be and how we can use them. It is more and more difficult for new chemical products to be brought into the market, because there are increasingly strict criteria. So I think that's an obvious trend. The Sustainable Use Directive will be maintained over the next while, and there is, as I say, a focus at European level, particularly around IPM. There is work going on as well on things like the new genome techniques, where the discussions are ongoing within the Polish presidency that we have now. And this regulation that's being discussed will be to form a framework so that these could be used in the future. Of course, not a silver bullet, but could help in our discussions where we talk about IPM and how we might develop that. So I suppose just that's a quick summary, and we can have a further discussion as part of the panel discussion. I'd just like to thank you for your attention, and happy to take any questions or comments during our chat.
Thank you, AnneMarie. So I'd like to invite Shay and Stephen Kildea. Stephen is leading IPM 2030, the project that Robert and Meghan talked about, and AnneMarie to the panel. So the poll that was up there, what IPM measures do you apply on your farm? Obviously there was a list of ones there. Not surprising, crop or variety selection, rotation at the top. Stephen?
Yep.
Yeah.
Should be.
Yeah, absolutely. It really is the key, as we saw with the IPM pyramid that was there. I suppose, Stephen, I'm going to throw one question to you before we see the other Slido questions. Meghan touched on the amount of work that's being done and published in the scientific literature, and we know that there are literally thousands of research studies around the world done on IPM, but why are we not more down the road? And I mean, Meghan mentioned the variability as well. Surely we should be getting more answers.
Yeah, it's a very, I suppose, honest question to ask. It's quite a difficult one to give a real clear answer for. I think one of the main reasons is the complexity of crop production in itself. The regionality that I think that Meghan has also highlighted clearly identifies that one solution, in a simple sort of one solution, is not possible across, I suppose, every region and every crop from an IPM perspective, because IPM itself is sort of a build-up of various different measures adding on to each other. So I also want to say one thing, that, as you highlighted at the start, Ewan, it's not that we aren't practicing IPM. I think all farmers and all growers do actually practice IPM, and as the highlight there in the survey, the solutions that they take and would try to implement, I think the aspect is the availability of those solutions, such as the tolerant varieties and the specific regionality that might actually be there. From an Irish perspective, if we think of wheat, and we'll be talking about it in the afternoon, septoria is our major problem. But actually, if you go across Europe, then other issues will also rise. Yeah. And I think from an IPM, if we target one, we inevitably will be leaving others, so it's extremely complex.
Yeah, absolutely, it's not easy. So, AnneMarie, you mentioned the Sustainable Use Regulation. We all know it was taken off the table in 2024. You touched on why, but obviously the most important thing is what's next. There was one question on it there. Sorry, it's dropped around. It's dropped off. But what the department have plans? Can you give us an idea what you anticipate might happen in terms of the SUR?
So the SUR, yes. So thank you. And so the SUR, as we knew it has been withdrawn. So we have the directive there, the SUD. So all focus will be on that for the foreseeable future. And really the focus there is on the requirement for things like IPM. But bearing in mind that runs alongside the other regulation that I mentioned, where the active substances are being reviewed.
Okay, there's another question there. Somebody wanting, obviously the EU Agricultural Commissioner mentioned a statement during the week about the double standard with pesticide use around the rest of the world versus Europe. I suppose it's come up before in terms of Brexit and the impact that's had as well, and the so-called, is it a level playing field?
Yes,
obviously isn't.
Yeah, so I've had it on my second slide, the regulation 396, which relates to residues. So I presume we're talking about MRLs here. So there is within that regulation the option or the possibility for what we call import tolerances for substances that are not approved at European level, bearing in mind that they do have to comply with the European standards from a human health point of view. So that was what was being referred to there. There have been some recent developments where the Commission have implemented additional criteria from an environmental point of view. So, for example, in relation to bees, on those import tolerances. So, really focusing in on that. And there has been a number of those import tolerances not granted at European level, but it is within the regulatory process that is a possibility. Okay. And of course, that's part within the whole trade and international trade. So obviously the Commission have to be cognizant of that as well.
Okay. Shay, we mentioned IPM works at the start. Do you want to give us a kind of a brief overview of what was the goal of it, the aim, and what measures did farmers employ, and what was the feedback in terms of IPM?
Yes, so as you say, Ewan, I was involved, as were a couple of the colleagues here. Stephen was involved in it as well, and there's a couple of farmers actually in the audience in an EU-wide project called IPM Works. So basically what it was trying to do was it was trying to promote IPM techniques. As you showed the IPM triangle earlier on today, it was trying to get farmers to come back down that triangle, start at the base, and look at the different techniques and methods that you can use before you got to the use of your pesticide, your chemical pesticide. So really what we had was a group of farmers who were advocates for those type of practices all across Europe, and the idea was that these farmers would showcase their methods, how they do it, because each of them are different to each farm. As Stephen said, Septoria is our big problem here. It might not be a problem in Italy. So we were looking at different problems and how we can overcome those problems in the different countries, and then trying to learn from one another. And things that came out of that project would have been the attitudes to things like grass weeds, how you control grass weeds, BYDV, these different things. And I suppose fundamentally in IPM, it's your attitude towards risk. And risk in terms of your crop and what you're prepared to do to make sure that you get as best a crop as you possibly can, bearing in mind that you're trying to reduce your reliance on pesticides at the same time. And I think that's the overall goal of that project, was to try and reduce our reliance, even though we can't eliminate it, as you said earlier on, try to reduce our reliance on pesticides and use all of the tools that we have.
So it seems at times the conversation, what you said, obviously, it really comes back to, I mean, AnneMarie talked about NGTs, and obviously we have BYDV, tolerant and resistant varieties coming through, but in the absence of robust varieties, it is very difficult, because the selection, that's the first choice you make. I mean, on the poll it shows varietal choice is key.
Yeah, and you're right, and it is something that we do, but if you take the BYDV tolerant varieties as a good example, farmers are very quick at adopting that new technology, and I'm sure the seed houses would show you the statistics that they're selling more and more of those type of varieties now because of that technology that's in those varieties. Yeah. And it does help to reduce our reliance on those pesticides.
Okay. AnneMarie, there's a question there about glyphosate in garden centres. If glyphosate was taken from every garden centre and shop shelves, was only allowed to be purchased by professional users, would that not reduce our use by 50%?
I can answer that by simply saying that the glyphosate would fit into the target 1, which we've already made so I suppose from that point of view, it wouldn't really help. I suppose the other thing, just to mention, that the glyphosate the products containing glyphosate will be reviewed as part of the process, and one of the things in that is for member states to pay particular attention to something like non-professional use. So it is in the mix from that point of view. But unfortunately, it wouldn't get us any further, yep. Or it might get us further. But we've already reached that target.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Stephen, Robert gave us a unique insight through the Delphi, and thank you to all the experts, many who are here in the audience today, for giving their time to engage with that process. It begs the question, what's next? Because that really, it gave us insight into what people think, and we talked about the variability in studies, but really, clearly there's a lack of studies here, and what's the plan going forward?
Yeah, I think what that demonstrated or provided us was key in terms of, okay, what we should be doing. And I think, look, as was highlighted, and I think as already mentioned, look, varietal resistance is critical. So, of course, look, we want to be able to get more resistant varieties, but equally then the whole system type approach that would have been identified there. What I would say is that if we had those varietal resistance, I'm pretty confident they would be used, just like Shay said, from a BYD perspective. They were taken up quite quickly. But I suppose we need to look at the overall package. It's not just specifically one disease. Take that wheat, for example. Look, Septoria again would be the prime example. Resistance may exist, but actually it's the other traits that are probably lacking on that. So it's an overall approach that is going to be required.
Okay, great. We just have one person. David, if you can get the microphone over here, please. Gentleman there. AnneMarie, sorry, Shay, I don't know if you want to tackle the first one there.
Malt and barley, and the attitude of or the use of older varieties. Yeah, and I think that's a common issue with malting growers. But I think we have to look as growers, we look at one set of criteria that those varieties bring in terms of standing power, disease resistance, those type of issues. But on the other side, on the customer side of the equation, they're looking at malt characteristics, malt yield, quality of malt, those type of characteristics. So there's
a reluctance
to change away from those because the customer wants those type of quality malts.
Yeah, I should add that I suppose that's one of the reasons why the Centre for Brewing and Distilling, we've invested in Oak Park, was to try and expand that analysis there to help the sector in that regard. So, sorry, the gentleman.
Just on the question there, the EU minister or commissioner, like say there's a reduction of 50% in malt for IPM, right? But that the products are coming from all around the world, sprayed with actives that are banned here. They're going into our food. Like, as the minister said, something that we're talking about the last 30 years is hypocritical. We're having a standard, but the food is coming in from all around the world with products that are actually banned. And it comes into our marketplace where it's because of the beneficial lower costs of production, it's competing with our food. And for farmers, if tillage is on its knees, no one is saying it here. Like it's all like it's been a great year. Look at the age profile of farmers. It's shocking. Why were the farmers striking around all Europe last February and March? Like the EU Commissioner was the first time to come out and say it. So like, look, I expect there's going to be more about it, but like we can't have a hypocritical thing. Like if it's a double standard, and he said it clearly.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, AnneMarie. Do you want to comment? It touches on the last question there as well.
I think it's a comment rather than a question. But what I would say on that is that, from the food point of view, the food safety standards that produce coming into Europe have to maintain are the same food standards that we have. But that's clear. But as I say, from the point of view of MRLs and the import tolerances, that is part of the regulation. There is the option to do that. It is a scientific assessment, but it's based on human health. So yes, there may be more about that, but at the moment, that's the regulation. Obviously, as I said, this is within a trade, an international trade, which is in an interesting stage at the moment. So there's a lot of discussions. But I did see the Commissioner's point, and it is part of as I say, part of the regulation as we speak.
Thank you. Stephen, what's being done to keep what little chemistry we have left? I mean, it comes back to managing the actives, and I know in the workshop in the afternoon you're talking about disease control decisions moving on.
Yeah, I think it's about IPM. It's about using all our available tools. And part of IPM is actually about pesticide selection. It's about what pesticide to use and when to use it, how much to use it, and equally about anti-resistance. So they are measures that we need to use, and we need to be very aware of when and how we use them.
Yeah. Okay. Shay, it's a bit of a nightmare scenario question. Could some crops disappear from our rotations because of these reductions? Obviously, we sincerely hope that's not the case.
We'd hope not, but I suppose look, I deal with potatoes as well, and I deal with some horticultural growers as well. But I'd say the biggest risk would be in those small crops, the small area crops where some of those products are disappearing and it's becoming more and more difficult to control some of the pests that are in those.
I might just add, in terms of Robert's work, that is it's sort of an estimation. It's our best guess. It's not exactly, it's not what necessarily will be the complete number. But just to add to that, in addition to getting that number, we are bringing it forward and actually running it through the various different types of scenarios that might be in rotations. Okay, what rotations would be impacted more than others? And that's something I hope will come out in the next couple of months.
Okay, Anne-Marie, so I suppose the bottom question there about a worst case scenario where if there was a nightmare season and there was no alternatives, could it ever arise that a banned chemical could be used in an exceptional circumstance?
Yeah, so I suppose two things on that. One, from a product point of view, there is a possibility within the regulation to grant what we call an emergency use, and under the existing regulation, and we have implemented that where needed, and so it's on a case-by-case basis, and it depends on the particular scenario. So yes is the short answer, that it is possible.
Shay?
Yeah, and just to come in on that, I mean, it's a question I get asked every year in terms of, AnneMarie knows as well, in terms of desiccating potatoes, and it's the case that we have, there's a process you have to go through in terms of, AnneMarie says, it's an emergency use, so there has to be an emergency in that situation or in that season for that particular product to be used. We have got the last 2 or 3 years for the use of dicot to desiccate potatoes because of the seasons that we have. Some people now have the expectation that we get it every year. That's not the case. If we had a normal season this year, there's no way we'll probably get.
Don't expect it.
No.
Yeah.
No.
Okay. Stephen, it touches on what we talked about before. Any plans for Irish trials with reduced pesticide inputs, rather than relying on opinion or less relevant non-Irish data? Obviously, the first step was to look at the non-Irish data and opinion, because that helps frame our what we have to do. But obviously, doing trials on reduced pesticide usage is going to be critical going forward. But we need those varieties.
Absolutely. Look, I think that is our job to do that. I think the one caveat there is that there's a lot of pesticides, there's a lot of targets, and so it's not going to be possible to do everything. And I think when we looked at that list of the candidates for substitution, you can clearly see that there's a large range there. And trying to get trials on everything there would be pretty much impossible.
Yeah.
Targeting it to those that are, I suppose, critical within each different cropping system is, I suppose, where we would be looking.
Yeah, absolutely. There was a question about roadblocks and NGTs. So as Anne-Marie, I can just very quickly take that. As Anne-Marie mentioned, the Polish presidency has published a document which is re-looking at the NGT issue in terms of pushing it on. And while that's happening in Europe, I suppose from our perspective, just to add, in Oak Park, as we've said clearly many times before, we see NGTs as a critical tool in helping the sector, and it's just one of many tools. No doubt in a few years' time there'll be another breeding tool. So it's a very important piece of work, and we are pushing it forward and using it at the moment to look to develop new material, to not just in terms of to develop new material for new varieties, but actually to develop example lines that could then be put into the IPM management regimes that Stephen has talked about. Top question there, Stephen, I suppose Shay, PDM, flufenicet and diflufenican are on the hit list. Are there alternatives for winter crops?
You start, you want to go?
I was going to say, look, I suppose the alternatives will be post-stems, and they are going to be at risk of resistance. So it is a bit of a double-edged sword, being honest.
Yeah, and I was just going to say that. But the other thing is, and it's not to dismiss the loss of those chemicals, because they will be hugely important. But we're lucky in a way in comparison to other crops. We do have some alternatives at the moment. But again, the big issue with those, rather than the loss of those chemicals, is the development of resistance to the remaining chemicals. And VJ is doing quite a bit of work in Oak Park on that as well. So it's a double-edged sword if from that point of view as well. You know.
Yeah, absolutely. So I should add that obviously the Weed Clinic workshop in the afternoon, VJ will get into that in a bit more detail. And also we have the disease control workshop as well. So well worth attending those. There was one question, the second one there, sorry Anne-Marie, is there a possibility of pesticides becoming only available on a prescription basis from a pesticide advisor?
Not under the current regulation. There was some discussion about that under the SUR, but under the existing system or the existing regulations, no.
Okay, so look, I'm going to end it there. Apologies, we went a few minutes over, and I'm conscious that lunch is being served very shortly. So I want to thank Shay, Steve, and AnneMarie, and Meghan and Robert for their contributions to the session. So that ends the morning session. Obviously, we have the afternoon workshops. I just want to make one comment, and I suppose it's really important. I just want to say thanks to all the Oak Park staff who contributed to this event. We have over 440 attendees today, which we're really delighted with, but it could only happen with all the work from the people out at the front desk and everybody else in the background. So thank you very much for attending. I hope you enjoy your lunch, and we see you in the afternoon. Thank you.